My name is Ana. I've been studying greater gliders for almost 10 years now, and I'm really excited to teach you all about them and some of the latest research about them. So today we're going to actually launch straight into tree hollows because they are a really significant habitat resource for greater gliders and a lot of other species. We'll learn about which species use these hollows and why. We'll talk about some of glider research that I've done and some of the latest findings about them, and also about their conservation in the context of their habitat. So to set the scene, tragically, Australia is really well known for having the highest rates of mammal extinction globally. We're the leaders of that, and part of the reason for that is the habitat loss. So 40% of all of our forests across Australia have been cleared and lost, and what remains is quite degraded. For example, down in the Victorian Central Highlands, there's only 1% remaining of all growth forest. Everything has been logged and regrown, and we're losing these really critical habitat in the forms of old hollow-bearing trees. So firstly, what is a hollow? Well, it's pretty easy. They are holes in trees, also known as cavities, and they can be in trunks or branches or live or dead trees. Now, scientists love to categorize things, and a hollow isn't just a hollow. There's many different types. So we've got trunk main hollows, trunk top hollows, trunk hollows in the middle of branches, and hollows at the end of branches. Then we have some interesting ones that are fissures and cracks, which microbats really love to use. And this one is always fun for the kids. I love learning about this hollow, but hollows. So at the base of trees, these amazing hollows. How do these hollows form though? These large cavities in the trunks or the limbs of trees? Well, there's a few processes. So lightning strikes, wind breaking, cockatoos, fire, termites, fungi, a whole collection of processes work together, some more than others, some at different time scales, but collectively over time these pressures start to decay that wood and form those hollows. And how long does it take for such hollows to form? Well, for something as small as shown here at the top, for an animal, the feather-tailed glider about the size of a 50-cent coin, it can take up to 100 years from germination for that tree to grow old and for that hollow to form. For something a bit more medium size, say the size of 2 tennis balls, we're looking potentially up to 200 years. And then for the really large hollows that cockatoos and large gliding species and possums use, sometimes they can take up to 300 years. So I thought we could play a bit of a game because there's so many different size hollows and different shapes and sizes, and all of Australia, there are forests with these hollows. There's quite a number of species that use them. So raise your hand if you think Australian wood ducks use tree hollows. Ooh, immediately got lots of hands up. Yes, good work. So they do use them, they raise their young in them, and it would be quite a sight to see. I've yet to see it, I would love to see it, but the ducklings just hatching and plopping out. Next one, Australian owlet nightjar. Hands up if you think, yes, 50% of the room have their hands up. Great work. Also using tree hollows as well. Brush-tailed possum. Come on, enthusiastic, yes, come on. If they're not living in your roof or in your compost or causing a ruckus, they are in tree hollows. So yes, that's an easy one. And in fact, they're one of the species that I really don't want to come across in the treetops. They scare me. What about wombats? It's a bit of a theme going, but a bit of a tricky one because wombats are really good at digging, but surprisingly, they will take the opportunity and live in hollow logs. So fallen trees, they are hollow, and just because they're no longer vertical and they're horizontal, still technically a hollow, and the wombats are using them. And I just got scared by this guy. This is a photo from Tasmania, when I was sticking my heads inside of hollow logs in Cradle Mountain National Park. I was looking for quolls, and then just stuck my head in, and there was a wombat going, "Rah." I was like, oh. Round 2. What about huntsman spiders? Yep, we've got a few nods and a few hands up. Yes, unfortunately they do love tree hollows. Unfortunate for me and my team. I have this memory of my student climbing up a tree. A volunteer, we were out there trying to catch greater gliders from their hollows for a genetics study, and our volunteer forgot their glasses that night and was like, "Oh, I saw eyeshine, there's a greater glider in that hollow." So she quickly sets up a rope, climbs up, and I'm like, cool, Mike is up there doing her thing. And then I hear this blood-curdling scream. I go, "Oh shit, what's going on?" And I've never seen anyone come out of a tree so fast before. She rappels down. And I'm like, "Are you okay? What's up?" And she's just shaking. When she stuck her head into that hollow, her torch was on, and what shone back was thousands and thousands of the eyeshine of a whole nest of huntsman spiders. My student has arachnophobia. It was a pretty rough night. So yes, they do use hollows, much to my dismay. What about Indian minor birds? Yep, your hands up. So yes, unfortunately they do use tree hollows, and they compete with native species for nesting locations. And skinks. I think skinks would use tree hollows. Yeah, got lots of nods. I mean, so far there is a bit of a trend here. And yes, they also use hollows as temporary shelter to escape like extreme heats of the day and things like that. So in summary, there are over 300 vertebrate species in Australia that use tree hollows. And so there are 80 mammal species, over 100 birds, almost 80 reptiles, and almost 30 amphibians. This makes up 90% of our parrots, half of all of our small bats, 90% of our owls, and 100% of our tree keepers and gliders. They're really, really important source of habitat. Why are they important? Well, 3 key reasons. Hollows are used by these species for either denning, so they're nocturnal, and they've become nocturnal because Australia is quite hot and they've evolved to be nocturnal. So during the day they need a place to den that's cool and away from the heat of the day. So deep inside old trees, really well insulated. It can be 46 degrees outside, but 26 inside the tree hollow. So really good thermal buffering. They're also an important space to find protection from predators. And lastly, most important, it's a safe space for them to raise their young. And often a question that gets asked is, well, how many hollows do we need in our forests? Lots. So one study put forward that we need, looks like, on average, in certain landscapes, at least 30 hollows per hectare to support a rich diversity of species. And if we look at one particular landscape, such as the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, which is over 1 million hectares, that looks like almost 31 million hollows. Really, really important habitat. And we need lots of it to support all these populations of all these various sized creatures that need them for all kinds of various purposes. So moving on from the importance of hollows, there is one, so hollows is what I spend a lot of my time focusing on. In fact, I just have a chronic collection of tree hollows and a lot of me sticking my head in them, sticking out of them, just exploring all the hollows. I'm obsessed. They're really fascinating spaces to study for so many reasons. And I've studied a lot of different arboreal mammal species, gliding species, possum species, and even spotted-tailed quolls as well throughout my career. And they all rely on these tree hollows. I wish I could spend all day telling you about every single one of these species, but I'm just going to focus on one, and that is the greater glider. Now, I could stand here and yap about them, but I actually have a little video that I've made about them that I made for a grant application, which I didn't get, but I still got this awesome video that really sets the scene of why they are so cool and so special. So.
Across the forests that line the east coast of Australia, a curious and elusive creature of the night calls it home. After sunset, under the cover of night, the greater glider emerges from its hollow. After checking that the coast is clear, it climbs up into the canopy to begin foraging on the leaves of eucalyptus. If threatened by predators, the greater glider will launch itself from the canopy and, using its thin membrane, glide to escape to safety. Unfortunately, this incredible animal is endangered. Deforestation, wildfires, and climate change threaten this species with extinction. My name is Ana Gracanin, and I study this little-known animal to help improve our understanding of what they need and how they use their habitat. To do this, our team climbs way up into the canopy so we can better study them close up. Greater gliders especially love old growth trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. In these trees, there are lots of naturally formed hollows, providing spaces inside that gliders use as dens. So I've just climbed up this tree, investigating this hollow here. We've installed a motion sensor camera above it, and this will allow us to monitor what animals are using this hollow. We can also measure what's going on inside, so how much moisture, how much rainfall is getting inside, and if that affects the living conditions when sleeping during the day inside that den. So we'll have a look inside now. This is a fantastic example of a really good den. It's really narrow, so we can't even get all the way inside. And what that means is quite protected from potential predators. This hollow is facing up and water can collect inside. Because the whole tree is hollow, almost all the way to the bottom, it allows the water to seep down and not pool and collect inside the actual den space.
So yes, that is the greater glider. And unfortunately, it's this amazing species that has adapted to eating eucalyptus leaves and living in these tree hollows, and it's very specialist. But unfortunately, habitat loss, wildfires, and climate change are the three biggest threats, and has resulted in their local extinction in many areas and continues to cause lots of population declines in various locations around Australia. Furthermore, habitat fragmentation is also a significant threat, followed by more localised threats like hyperpredation, competition, and barbed wire fencing. So, some of the research I've been involved in is that, well, to be able to understand populations and their health and their viability is to understand their genetics. And one of the things we wanted to know was where their stronghold populations were. Where were they inbred? Where were they high genetic diversity? And to be able to do that, we need to get small tissue samples from the edge of their ear. But to do that, this animal lives 20, 30, 50, 60 metres up in the canopy, depending how tall the forest is. And they eat eucalyptus leaves. So setting up a cage trap filled with eucalyptus leaves in a tree that's already got eucalyptus leaves doesn't really work. So, nope. The other idea that's out there is, and what's been sometimes used, is a giant pole with a net on the end. And that doesn't work. You need really, really, really tall pole. And then lastly, there's an old school method back in the day where they would get a rifle, shoot the branch that the greater glider was on, the branch would snap and break, and the glider would parachute and fall to the ground. Also noted, not an option for me in national parks. Working with an endangered animal, definitely don't want to be using guns and all that kind of thing. So with a lot of observation work and a lot of trial and practice, we worked out that we can just climb the trees in a certain way and catch them directly from the treetops. So we locate the glider coming out of a hollow, climb up just as sun is setting, wait outside the entrance. If they're inside, we can scoop them up. Otherwise, we wait for them to come out. Then we come down, do our measurements, get our do our morphology assessments, health assessments, get all the things, and then we release them back onto the tree. So that's one of the things that we created just a few years ago. We published this method. And here's a nice little video showing the method in action. Climbing up the tree, setting up a line. And there it goes. Easy life, easy as pie. Just have to climb the tree at night.
Got it.
But that method really helped us to do a lot of genomic assessment and health assessment, which has not been done before, so which I'll touch on a bit later. Another bit of research that I was involved in is looking at the effect of wildfires on greater gliders. So in the study location of Wonga National Park, down south near Bateman's Bay, Braidwood area, 98% of the national park burnt. So we were interested in understanding, well, how did the population do after such a catastrophic event? And what we found was that on the bottom we have low, moderate and high severity areas, fire severities, and those sites we had more greater glider density, higher density on the left, compared to moderate and to high. Very clear pattern that the hotter it burns and the more foliage is destroyed and the more hollows are destroyed, gliders can't survive that. They lose their habitat and they lose their food resource. And another interesting pattern that we found as well was that where it was a low severity fire, was there tended to be, so on the side there, we have more hollows surviving and being present in this, where it's been low severity fire, but where it's moderate and high severity fire, the hollows were at a lower density. So there's a relationship that we found between those sites. So I mentioned why we were catching gliders before. Well, we wanted to understand just a baseline of as many populations as possible. Where are the stronghold populations and where are the populations that are suffering the most? So the ones that are isolated, have experienced habitat loss. Are there big evidence of inbreeding and potential for populations to collapse? So we need to get that information. So we went around the south coast of New South Wales to a number of locations, both burnt and unburnt sites, and we caught almost 100 greater gliders, and we were able to understand what the situation is. And unfortunately, it's not too great. So a lot of the populations on the south coast are highly fragmented and showing evidence of genetic decline and inbreeding. But we did find some populations that were doing well, and that was one particular one up there on the escarpment in the catchment area just below south of Sydney. So a really big stronghold population there with large genetic diversity and a large effective population size. So positive that we have got that, and it also helps us to identify where areas need help and we need to do more conservation work. One other study that I looked at was looking at nest boxes. So we can do something with all these tree hollows being lost. There is some techniques out there, and one of them is the use of nest boxes. So we trialled 40 of these at a site that had burnt to see if greater gliders would use them. And we put motion sensor infrared cameras on all the boxes to monitor them. And what was really interesting, that over a 12-month period, every single one of those nest boxes got used at least once by a greater glider. So it was really cool to see that they were going to use this artificial type of habitat. And one glider in particular, so that's my hand after I installed the nest box and the camera, 2 hours after installation, a greater glider appears on camera. So they were very curious about these southern boxes that appeared in their home. So the average time for them to investigate was about 11 days since installation, and the average time for them to use these boxes was 34 days.
Here, this is one of our nest boxes we installed. Little look inside. Yay! Mama baby fast asleep. Beautiful.
Another question that I recently was asking and we worked on was a research paper on the gliding ability of greater gliders. And this was a really interesting study where we used a lot of infrared and thermal binoculars, similar to the tech that the Oberon Citizen Science Network uses to record how they glide and how they move through the landscape. So very simple method of finding a glider, getting a laser pointer so we could mark the exact point of where its paws were on the branch that it was on, watch it glide, terrible drawing right there, and then mark immediately where it landed. And then because we had those very precise points, we could measure all the distances and the angles and the drops and height and account for everything. And we got some cool videos as well. Whee! And then this is a slow-mo infrared shot of one gliding. So what we found was that even though they're called the greatest glider, it turns out that they're not that great at gliding. They're called the greater glider because of their size. They're the largest gliding marsupial in Australia. But when we punch the numbers, they have an average glide ratio of 1:1. So what that meant, on average, for every metre that they dropped in height, they moved across about 1 metre. Other species like yellow-bellied gliders and sugar gliders have ratios of up to 2:1 or 3:1. So really efficient gliders and can really glide quite far. And why is this important? Well, it's important to understand that if habitat gets fragmented, we need to know if greater gliders can cross the road or cross that clear habitat. Because they are adapted to a life in the canopy, they do not come to the ground, they're really vulnerable on the ground, they are completely reliant on that canopy. So there are large canopy gaps, really problematic because it stops them from being able to access resources, disperse, have their population expand, grow, and that kind of thing. So it also helps to inform then the structures that we can use to kind of mitigate that using glide poles, for example, where glide poles are installed over roads to help them cross those distances. We haven't seen grey gliders use these structures yet, but it might be an artefact that they were spaced in the way to facilitate other species that are better at gliding, so they were spaced further apart. So it'd be good to see in the future using that 1-to-1 ratio that we found to better inform the spacing of structures and to better evaluate habitat fragmentation. Something else I'm doing at the moment is 3D modelling hollows. Recreating their habitat is really, really hard. As mentioned before, can take 300 years, even longer, for these hollows to form. So understanding the volume, the shape, the surface area, the thickness of the wood, we can get that from creating these complex 3D models. So that if we want to recreate these habitats artificially, we have some information about how to inform that. So on to a bit of a final note about conservation and how we can restore greater glider habitat and habitat for other species. So lots of methods out there: wooden nest box, plastic nest boxes, PVC pipes, modular boxes, hollow logs, chainsaw carving, and hollow hull carvings. So physically, mechanically altering the wood to the trunk or the branch to remove the wood to recreate that hollow. And it's a bit tricky because a lot of these techniques have evolved and refined over time, and one of the biggest troubles that we have with all these different methods is how well do they insulate, because replicating an old growth tree in a box is really, really hard. So when comparing the heat between these various artificial hollows, during a hot day of 37 degrees, it was actually 46.6 degrees in the wooden nest box and 30 degrees inside the artificially carved hollow inside the tree, whereas it was 28 degrees in the natural hollow. So it's really hard to replicate nature. Like, old trees do it really well. So these new emerging techniques where we're shifting away from boxes to carving hollows is really exciting. But there's still an area of research that we're still delving into. I feel like I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go. Further challenges include weight and size, pest nutrition, but we have clever solutions for these boxes and how they can be used. So creating better insulation capacity on the top right, and other studies have found an automated door to stop predators like sugar gliders in Tasmania from eating critically endangered bird eggs. And I mentioned that new technology of carving wood out of the tree to recreate those hollows. So this is a new tool called the hollow hog, which is really exciting. The video's not working, that's all right. And the idea is that, instead of pruning the dead wood off these limbs, for example, you could actually prune it and then carve into it. So in urban areas and peri-urban areas, we can start to bring back some of these hollows. So for example here, instead of cutting it right to the trunk, you cut it a little bit further out and you carve into that piece of wood. But really, the best solution is, as I mentioned before, Blue Mountains World Heritage Area might have 31 million hollows or more, and to artificially carve or install millions of nest boxes is not really a solution. They're just band-aids, because what we need to do is restore the hollow formation cycle. So we need to have mixed age trees, so that way these gaps that we have can be filled. So in the meantime, we can use these techniques to fill that gap, but we want to stop this habitat loss and just have these trees become old, have these forests become old again. So there are these mixed ages that are constantly growing in age, forming hollows, and as ones lose and fall over and die and start to disappear, there's ones to replace them. One study found that in the Canberra area, the solution was that we need to have 40% greater longevity of the trees currently, establish more seedlings by 60%, and create artificial hollows by 30% to just compensate for those short-term deficits, and then we can restore that cycle. Yes, so that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana. That's fantastic. We've just got a few minutes we could spare for audience questions. Does anyone have any questions for Ana?
Thank you. Just a question about the 7 Mile Beach National Park population. How were they looking genetically? Were they looking like they're inbreeding?
Yeah, unfortunately, the initial genetic assessment found that they were levels of inbreeding. But what was also interesting was that we found a potential pattern that they are unique in their adaptations. So there was a pattern where they had certain genes that correlated strongly with the climatic conditions that they had, which is like a very hot, low elevation population. So compared to all the other populations we studied, they stood out as different. One, because of the isolation and the relative inbreeding, but two, they also stood out because they had potential, they had adaptive potential for climate change. So that was a really interesting finding. And just recently we updated that research with more genetic samples and found that, yes, unfortunately there are cases of, for example, grandfather, granddaughter breeding and having offspring, so high levels of inbreeding in that sense. But overall, despite that, it's still a large enough population that they can be a bit robust to the extreme detrimental impacts of inbreeding. And so we just need to think long term either about connecting that habitat because it's so isolated, it's been isolated for over 200 years, or potentially doing translocation planning to make sure that they have a bit of genetic diversity so that they can adapt with changes. But yeah, 7 Mile Beach is a really important population for a number of reasons. And yeah, I'm optimistic that they'll survive and flourish.
One more question?
Thank you. Can you tell me what age they live to, how many babies they have, at what age? Thank you.
Yeah. So greater gliders in captivity have been reported to live for 11 years, but in the wild it would be typically less. And they only have one baby at a time, once a year, and the juveniles take about a year and a half to grow up and disperse and leave the parents. And so they have a fairly slow life cycle and output in terms of reproductive output. And if the conditions aren't good, sometimes the females will skip a year. And in rare cases, they will have twins, but often the twins don't survive because they are living off eucalyptus, which is really not very low nutritional value, very low nitrogen content, not a lot of protein that they can get from that. So often, if they do have twins, one might not survive because it's just having to provide twice the amount of milk, and they're a very sensitive creature, and they don't have a lot of fat reserves, and they're having to eat eucalyptus leaves are similar to koalas. They're a bit slow. They have to conserve their energy. So yeah, they're quite sensitive to these threats that I mentioned before because it takes them a while to raise their young. Sometimes they skip, and so yeah, population growth takes a while. Compared to more other species like antechinus that rapidly breed every year.
Okay, fabulous. So thanks so much, Ana.
If anyone has any further questions, you can find me at morning tea. Happy to answer them.
Afternoon tea.
Afternoon tea. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Ana stays up all night and sleeps during the day, just like a great glider.
I am a glider.